So I've been interested for a long time in the big processes that change things in ecosystems. And for me, one of the fundamental things to think about when we're thinking about ecosystems or how we define ecosystems, for me, there's a lot of different definitions that people attach to ecosystem. But in my mind, ecosystems and their importance are the interaction between the physical and the biological, and the feedbacks both ways between those broad elements. And that creates an ecosystem. And wildfires are a huge physical driver in our ecosystems. We tend to think of them in a fearful way because they're scary and they're very destructive. But in the West, they are a natural part of and natural force in our ecosystems. So obviously this is an enormous topic, talking about the wildfire ecology of the West. So we can't get into too much detail about it, but mainly what I wanted to drive home was the notion that it is part of our ecosystems. Our ecosystems were formed in part largely because of the interactions of wildfires and how they help change patterns of both species distribution and other processes, biogeochemical processes in our watersheds in the Rocky Mountain West. So I've just highlighted a couple things to think about in terms of what we think of as the natural or normal or historical aspects of wildfires and some of the key ecological aspects. So all of us know that as we go up in elevation, our ecosystems change a little bit, our forest types change. And our lower elevations, we tend to have forests that are dominated by ponderosa pines. And when we walk around and we see the ponderosas now, those patterns that we see historically were largely driven by the types of wildfires that we would have had in those ecosystems. Ponderosa pine forests historically had a fire regime that was more about having low and moderate intensity fires. They tended to be ground fires, lower in the canopy, not big crown fires. And they had a return interval, depending on which part of Colorado you were in, more or less on a 5 to 30-ish year time cycle, with a lot of mixed intensities in there. So historically what we had, if you look at archival photos of the Front Range, what you see in the lower montane systems is this really big open canopy stands where you have a lot of mature trees, not very much ground cover. I think the expression used to be that you should be able to drive your horse and wagon through the forest in the ponderosas because that's how much space were between the trees. And that was maintained by fire. And as we went up in elevation, that changes. We have lodgepole dominated stands, and their ecology is totally different, but still completely reliant on fires. They have a much, much, much longer fire return interval, somewhere into the hundreds of years. The trees, lodgepoles have what are called serotinous cones, so the seed production and survival and regrowth is dependent on high intensity fires opening up those seeds and allowing other generations to spring up. So really different types of stands, really different types of ecologies, but still intimately linked with wildfire. So we know that wildfires used to play this really dominant role in our ecologies and our forests. But in recent years, in recent decades, we have been observing that some of the patterns that we had formerly expected with wildfires are starting to change, and specifically changing in the Rocky Mountain West. So what that graph on your right shows is the blue line on the bottom, that's sort of a little bit flatter, is the number of fires that we've been having. So that's been increasing somewhat. But the key thing to look at is that the size of the fires that we've been having has been dramatically increasing. And with that is sort of an indicator of the intensity of fire, the destructiveness of fires. So why is that happening? Now, this isn't going to be a surprising story to any of you. I'm sure you've heard it in the news recently with all of the fires that have been happening in the past couple of years in the Front Range. But basically, the big picture story of what people are discussing as to why we're seeing some of these patterns. In part, it's the received history of our land management decisions. So we know we don't like having fires. We're scared of them. They destroy our homes. They destroy our roads. They destroy our communities. And they make it difficult for us to produce timber or to range cattle in forests. So we've made decisions over the many decades to suppress fires in our forests. But when we do that, we take away that ecological role that fire was playing, particularly in our ponderosa pine-dominated forests. And so instead of having fires where we would let them happen relatively frequently and they'd be small and they'd keep the ground cover contained or controlled, we suppress all of the fires before they even have a chance to do that work. And then what happens is we get this huge increase in fuel loads in the forest. We let that ground cover grow up. We let Douglas fir grow up underneath the ponderosas. And then we have what are called ladder fuels, that when a small fire comes into that area, it picks up all that fuel, and instead of staying close to the ground, it goes up into the canopies and becomes a huge crown fire, and those produce a lot of energy and a lot of intensity very quickly and become very hard to control. And then we see things like the fires that we've been having, which spread really, really rapidly and cause a huge amount of destruction. So, you know, it's a classic example of, at the time, we thought we were doing the right thing for managing our landscapes. We thought that by reducing or suppressing fires that we would be protecting our forests and protecting our communities. But in reality, what we were doing was punting the problem down the line. We were just shoving the higher risk and furthering the or exacerbating that risk onto someone else's shoulders. And I had to show a picture of Smokey because he's, you know, the classic image and icon of suppressing forest fires. So one of the reasons why we continue to suppress forest fires is because we keep wanting to move into places where there are forests. We like being in trees, we like being in the mountains. And so this map's a little bit hard to see the different distinctions, but what you're seeing on the left, these gray spots are what are called areas of wildland-urban interface, or more commonly known as the WUI, one of my favorite acronyms. And so what you can see is the pink blotches, those are our foothill areas of the mountains. The flat parts, you can see Denver marked right there. So we have these high concentrations of people moving into the WUI areas. And what you see in the right-hand graph is the projection for that increase over the next couple of decades. So we are moving, more of us are moving into these wildland-urban interface areas because we like being in the forests, we like the mountains, it's quiet, it's pretty. But the reality is that every person who moves into the WUI increases the pressure on responders and politicians to want to put out more fires. And it also makes it much more difficult for us to do management techniques that would help us mimic forestry or fire patterns. So we have this conflicting change in attitudes where we know that we need to do something about the fuel loads, and we know we should be doing something about how suppressing fires is affecting wildfire risk and outcomes, but more and more people are moving into these areas, making it a harder problem to deal with.